just where have you been, boy? Harry says I was with one of my professors from school. Vernon says what did I tell you about mentioning that place? Harry says but you asked. Petunia sneers and says that is enough, make the dinner then return to your room. Harry sighs and says yes, Aunt Petunia. Vernon says oh and boy there will be no more going out, is that understood? Harry says yes Uncle Vernon. Harry walks into the kitchen and starts cooking. Dudley walks in and says where were you really, Potter? Harry says Dudley I know you want to try and get me into some kind of trouble but for once I'm asking you nicely to leave it alone. Dudley says fine, have it your way, Potter. How long before dinner is ready? Harry, confused and shocked, says about 15 minutes. Dudley says Potter there won't be any more of those things, will there? Harry says I sure hope not. Vernon shouts Dudley what are you doing in there with that boy? Harry says you better go, you don't need to get in any trouble. Back at the Burrow, a picture is needed. Molly says Arthur I really don't like the idea of our children being involved in a group like this. Arthur says Molly I understand but I still say Albus knows what he is doing. And our children need to learn to drop this silly rivalry. Molly sadly smiles and says I know dear. Perhaps I should just start dinner. Arthur smiles and says would you like any help? Molly says oh no dear, you look exhausted. Arthur says all these extra raids and with you know who things at the ministry have been crazy. Upstairs in Ginny's room, Ginny angrily says can you believe that Professor Dumbledore expects us to learn from Potter? Hermione says Ginny I don't like the idea any more than you do but we can't deny that Potter is the best in defense against the dark arts. Ginny says even if that's true how does Professor Dumbledore expect us to just forget everything Potter has done? Episode continues. Hermione says Ginny I know Potter and the Slytherins have caused a lot of trouble but none of us are completely innocent. Do you remember the time I fell from the bookshelf in the library and Potter caught me? Ginny says I don't remember you telling me that story. Hermione sighs and says well one evening I was in library and I saw a book that caught my interest so being foolish I started to climb the shelves and my foot slipped and I fell. Potter somehow saw me fall and he actually caught me. Do you know how I thanked him, Ginny? I slapped him in his face. Ginny says did he touch you or hurt you? Hermione says no he didn't do anything but catch me but I acted on feelings alone and I slapped him. Ginny says Hermione why are you telling me this? Hermione says didn't you hear Professor Dumbledore, he wants us to work on coming together. We don't have to like Potter but if Professor Dumbledore trusts him then I'm gonna at least try to trust him. Ginny says but what about Ron? Just then Ron says what about me? Ginny says we were just talking about learning from Potter. Ron says not bloody likely, there is nothing that Potter will ever teach me. Hermione says Ronald you heard Professor Dumbledore. Ron says I will do whatever it takes to stop these lessons from ever happening. Ginny says Ron you are an idiot. Just then Molly shouts kids get cleaned up for dinner. Ron says brilliant, I'm starving. Hermione says nothing ever changes. Back at Privet Drive, a picture is needed. Vernon says boy what is taking so long? Harry mutters to himself if I was allowed to use magic this would be done by now. Vernon says boy I asked you a question. Harry says it's ready Uncle Vernon. Vernon says about time. Now off to your room, if there is any left after we are finished we'll let you know. Harry angrily says fine, have it your way. He leaves the room. Dudley says Dad was that absolutely necessary? Vernon confused says Dudley I don't understand. Episode continues. What has gotten into you? Dudley says just drop it Dad. Petunia says Vernon let's just eat then we can take Dudley to get some ice cream. Upstairs with Harry. Harry thinks to himself I don't understand why Dumbledore keeps insisting I come back here but sadly I have nowhere else to go. He grabs a notebook and pen and says well I guess I will start planning these lessons. Now back at Hogwarts, a picture is needed. McGonagall says oh Albus what did Horace say? Dumbledore chuckles and says he will return. McGonagall says how in the name of Merlin did you get him to change his mind? Dumbledore says I didn't. It was Harry Potter that helped change his mind. McGonagall says what do you mean it was Potter? You mean to tell me you used a student? Dumbledore says Minerva you know very well Lily was always a favorite of Horace. It was very vital that he return to Hogwarts. He has something that I require greatly. McGonagall says and just what is that? Dumbledore says I promise tell you and Severus when the time is right. McGonagall says did you talk to Potter about the defense against the dark arts group? Dumbledore says I did and he has agreed. And I spoke with Molly and Arthur Weasley about their children and they agreed along with Miss Granger. McGonagall says Albus do you think it's wise to? Dumbledore says Professor McGonagall we already talked about this. I feel this is very important. McGonagall says perhaps we should appoint a professor to watch over Dumbledore says it is important that we professors not interfere. The students must learn to trust one another. McGonagall says yes, Professor Dumbledore. We skip to 4 days later. At Privet Drive, a picture is needed. Harry sitting in his room when and Hedwig taps on the window, a picture is needed. Harry says, "Hey girl, it's good to see you." He takes the letter from her leg. Harry, Professor Dumbledore has given me permission to accompany you to Diagon Alley. Episode continues. If you don't mind me accompanying you, please send me a return as soon as possible and I will come to collect you in 3 days. Hoping to hear from you, Hagrid. Harry sighs and says, well Hagrid, I probably don't have much of a say in this, so why not? He grabs a piece of paper and writes, Hagrid, I would gladly accept you accompanying me to Diagon Alley. It will be great to see you and catch up. So I will see you in 3 days' time. He says, so girl, do you feel up to delivering another letter? Hedwig hoots and flaps her wings. Harry laughs and says, thank you girl, I promise you a bunch of rest when you return. He attaches the letter to Hedwig, she flies off. Harry says, safe flight girl. He goes and lays down on his bed and closes his eyes. 1 year earlier, Harry says, so Weasley, are you up to the task of stopping Ravenclaw so you can meet us in the finals? Ron says, just watch me, Potter. Besides, we have a secret weapon that Ravenclaw isn't ready for. Harry laughs and says, just what is that? Just then Ginny says, I'm playing Seeker and Cho won't know what hit her. Harry, just staring at Ginny, looks down and says, well, good luck then, don't let us Slytherins down. We look forward to playing you Gryffindors in the finals. He walks off. Ron says, what the bloody hell was that all about? Ginny, shocked, says, I don't know, but boy, he was acting weird. Hermione says, yeah, he sure was, and I wonder what it was all about. We skip to the end of the game. Ginny celebrating. Harry says, good game Weasley, that was some impressive flying. Ginny angrily says, oh, my goal was to impress the great Harry Potter. Now, my day is complete. Harry sighs and says, I was just trying to give you a legit compliment, but you know what, forget it. He walks off back to present day, Harry thinking to himself. Well, what do you expect, Potter, you being a jerk all these years, of course she is going to hate you. Episode continues. At Malfoy Manor, a picture is needed. Narcissa whispers, Lucius, we can't let this happen. Draco is just a boy. Lucius says, Narcissa, we have already discussed this. We don't have a choice. If we say no, the Dark Lord will kill us all. Narcissa says, fine, but I don't like this. You know he doesn't care if Draco lives. Just then Bellatrix screams, the Dark Lord wants everyone in the dining room now. Lucius says, Narcissa, I'm begging you, please don't step out of line. Narcissa nods and says, you have my word. They walk in the dining room. Voldemort hisses and says, ah, Lucius, there you are. Now where is young Draco? Episode continues. We skip to 2 days later. At the Burrow, a picture is needed. Ginny says, hey Mum, I was wondering when we were going to go to Diagon Alley. Molly frowns and says, I was trying to put that trip off for as long as possible, but we will be going tomorrow. Ginny says, Mum, why would you want to wait? Is there something you are not telling us? Molly says, of course not, dear. But you kids know how I feel about you returning to school this year. Ginny says, Mum, I know you are worried, but we aren't little kids anymore and Hogwarts still has Dumbledore. Molly frowns and says, I know, dear, but I am your mother and I will always want my children safe. Just then Ron walks in and says, hey Mum, how soon before lunch? Ginny says, Ron, do you ever think about anything other than food? Ron says, what, I'm hungry. Hermione says, what else is new, Ronald? Molly says, lunch will still be a little while. Your brothers should be coming for lunch. Ginny says, hey, about we go for a swim? Hermione says, you guys go ahead, I just want to read. Ron says, Hermione, you do realize that we are on break, right? Hermione angrily says, I'm well aware, Ronald, but unlike you I am going to be prepared for these defense against the dark arts lessons. Ginny says, you know what, Hermione, that actually isn't a bad idea. Ron says, I think you both are mental. It's not like that group is ever going to work. Molly says, Ronald Weasley, I may not like the idea of this group, but you will participate and comply with Professor Dumbledore's plan. Ron angrily says, yes Mum. I'm gonna go to my room. Ginny says, come on Hermione, let's go to my room for a while. Now at Privet Drive, a picture is needed. Harry says, Uncle Vernon, tomorrow I will be leaving to get some of my supplies for this upcoming year. Vernon sneers and says, just who is supposed to be taking you, boy? Harry sighs and says, do you remember Hagrid? The guy that came and collected me in my first year.